I've found this all through my time in media ops in Iraq and Afghanistan. You could have a perfectly reasonable grown-up conversation with the press office and the Ministry of Defence about how you were planning to deal with a particular issue, but that wasn't the final arbiter. The final arbiter was the politicians.
Welcome back to Veterans in Politics podcast. I'm your host, Army veteran Jonny Ball, and I've served on the front line of military operations, as well as a very different front line of UK politics. It was during my time working at the Ministry of Defence as a Crown servant, I got to meet this week's guest, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Plews. Derek has had an amazing career, working not only in the armed forces in uniform, but out of uniform too, working as a press officer and also an advisor to some of the big beasts in politics, including the late Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott. I knew that I simply had to get Derek on the show and tell a very different side of politics. We also discuss his amazing book, Shamrock Among the Poppies, which is an amazing tale of the work, sacrifice and service of the Royal Irish during a particular time in Afghanistan. So without further ado, it's time for you to meet our guest, Derek. It seems once in a while this podcast draws up some firsts for me, and this is a first where I've actually interviewed someone I used to work with in government, and I'm very, very chuffed to have my old mate Derek Plews on the show today. Though of course back then I wouldn't have called him my old mate, I would have called him Colonel Derek, wouldn't I, Derek?
Well, you called me all sorts of things, Johnny, really, didn't you? not to my face though.
Well, I certainly would have been a lot more reverent as a kind of slightly wet behind the ears Crown servant. But we had great fun working together. In fact, we worked together really well. You, of course, in uniform as a staff officer within reserve forces and cadets at the Ministry of Defence. Me out there in the field talking to employers at Defence Relationship Management. But we would team up a lot at events and with employers, and sometimes on quite tricky, thorny policy issues. But it was during that experience, so I got to learn about you and your background, which is absolutely fascinating. And when I saw that you're now weapons free and no longer in uniform or employed by the Crown, I thought I've got to get that man on the show.
Well, thanks very much for having me. But even though I might be weapons free, I guess I still need to be careful what I say. So let's see where this goes.
We'll see where it goes, but don't we all? But let's start where we mostly start with all of our guests, which is back at the beginning. And that's a young Derek who started out on this career. And what was the first sort of dalliance into uniform? And how did you find yourself serving in the British Army?
I started off my working life as a journalist in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Long time ago, and I worked for my local newspaper, and as part of that, because I was the youngster, they would send me off each year to annual camp with 5 UDR, which is the local battalion, and I really found it fascinating being away from the difficulties of serving in Northern Ireland and going off to somewhere in England where the guys could let their hair down and relax, And so I considered joining the EDR originally, and I remember sitting down with one of their officers and saying, "Look, I'd really like to give this a go." And he looked at me for a minute and he said, "Derek, given your civilian job, that's a really bad idea." And actually, when I sat down again and thought about it, he was right. But I wasn't prepared to give up on the military altogether. So I didn't join the UDR, but I went 16 miles up the road from where I lived, and joined the Territorial Army with A Company 4 Royal Irish, as it was then, as a private soldier, and that was great. So I got to I got to be a journalist, during the week, and a TA soldier at the weekends, and that was fantastic.
And it's perhaps worth contextualising that back then, during the Troubles, I myself did my time in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and also during the marching season. But I think you've slightly downplayed the juxtaposition you found yourself in of being a public figure as a journalist, because journalists are public figures, and the link to your military service. How did you balance that push and pull between being a public figure and actually standing up to serve in uniform at that time in particular?
So I was quite young at that time, and didn't think too much about the downsides of being in uniform, to be perfectly honest. And I didn't, and I'd go off and we'd do our training weekends and all the rest of it. And occasionally we'd bump into issues, but nothing too serious from as far as I was concerned. And that's how it carried on until I was about to get married. And suddenly I thought, well, it's one thing for me to accept these risks on my own behalf, but actually I need to think really seriously about whether I'm prepared to put my wife into that situation as well. And after a lot of consideration, I decided that probably wasn't fair. And that was one of the drivers that led me to actually move out of Northern Ireland and across the water to England. So I saw a job advertised in the Guardian for an MOD press officer, which originally wasn't based in England. The job I applied for was actually based in Lisburn, which I thought would be a bit different from where I was. And Londonderry is on the border and was it was Indian territory, whereas Lisburn not maybe not so dangerous. And I thought, right, well, I'll apply for this job in Lisburn. Went to London for the interview. Week later, I got a letter saying, "Congratulations, we'd like to offer you a job, but not in Lisburn. We'd like you to come and work for us at High Wycombe at RAF Strike Command, as it was then." And I remember sitting with a new wife, sitting looking at her, saying, "So what should we do?" Because we made up our minds we were going to move anyway. So, but instead of moving up the road to Lisburn, we were going to get on a ferry and go across to England. And we decided, well, a move's a move, so it doesn't matter whether it's Lisburn or England. Let's just do it. So I found myself in Buckinghamshire, and I haven't really gone very far since. So that's where I'm sitting today.
Wow, not a bad part of the world to find yourself in. And I'm always keen that I don't caricature what it was like in Northern Ireland, particularly for those that lived there during that time. But I am going to use a caricature, which is Derry Girls. I think Derry Girls, to a whole generation of young people. I mean, my wife is a wee bit younger than me, but not a great deal, 8 years. But we sat down and watched Derry Girls, and I was kind of pointing to the soldiers on the street going, "Oh, that was me." And in a way that kind of educated her about that time, because she kind of just missed it almost in terms of the memory. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, the appreciation of the reality, what it was like, and the knock-on effect for anyone in uniform in the country. I mean, even as a young cadet, you were told not to wear your uniform in public. And I think that for a period of time, and a lot of people in service, that wearing uniform and being public, which I guess leads on to our work that you and I worked on, which was the Armed Forces Covenant, particularly in industry, and trying to challenge that narrative and trying to get veterans to be a bit more public. How did you see that transition of perhaps, quite rightly, the very pragmatic security approach, as you've articulated about looking after your wife, and how did you see that transition from there to the work that we were doing in government, which was championing the armed forces in communities?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overplay the situation in Northern Ireland as far as my personal circumstances were concerned, because the TA didn't have an operational role on the streets in Northern Ireland, so it's not like we were sort of doing foot patrols in dodgy areas or anything like that. But we did have a responsibility to do our own security. So when we were doing a vehicle move, we provided armed guards on the vehicles to do the move, etc., which was, I found, a really interesting experience. But when I left Northern Ireland and I went to work in the Air Force for the Air Force, the first thing that happened was that my then boss said, "Derek, I understand you're in the Territorial Army." I said, "Yes, boss." Thinking, this is great because they're bound to be supportive here, aren't they? And he said, "Well, I don't think you can carry on serving and doing this job at the same time." And I was rather found that rather perturbing. So I said, well, why not? He said, because as a civilian in this job, you already have a war role. Sort of if we go to war against the Soviet Union, as it was in those days, you as a civilian, you'll be expected to step up to the mark. So you can't be a reservist and also have a war role in your civilian job. So you need to choose. And my choice was, well, I've got a mortgage to pay, so I need to lean in the direction of my civilian job. So that's what I did. But eventually he moved on, and I found a more supportive boss came along behind him. And so as soon as I got the chance, I signed up again, and served pretty much on and off, but served. So that would have been in 1985, and I served on and off from then until I retired in 2021.
So not a bad shift. But I think the story there of individual personalities making life easier or more difficult for reservists leads us to where we work together. I mean, what did you find when you arrived at the MOD and became a specialist within the employment engagement part of policy? What kind of changes did you see, and what kind of direction did you hear from government, and why did that come about? Why did we have the need to set up Defence Relationship Management?
Yeah, so before I go on to do that, the reason I told that story really was as a segue into this very issue, because it demonstrated for me the real importance of a supportive employer. If you're going to be a reservist, you need two things. You need an understanding family who are prepared to accept that you're going to be away more than they would like often. But just as importantly, you need a supportive employer. And that's really where I came in 2014 when we were setting up Defence Relationship Management, because it was just after we'd published the Future Reserves 2020 white paper, setting out a new expanded role for our reserve forces across the UK. But one of the things that we always knew, and it came through really clearly in a lot of the work that we'd done with reservists as part of that FR20 white paper, was this idea that if you're going to grow the reserves, you need to do something to persuade employers that they're going to support their employees who want to put on uniform. And that's one of the reasons why DRM was born. So it was created to forge new links between defence and employers, and encourage employers to be more supportive of their originally of their reservist employees, then expanded to take on Cadet Force Adult Volunteers as well, because they're in the same boat as reservists. Without a supportive employer, it's very difficult and not important to serve. And so DRM was born. I was part of my job was to help to set it up, and we did. And actually, it proved very quickly that it could deliver real impact in terms of the relationship between defence and those big organisations.
And every now and again, you used to pick up the phone to me as well.
Indeed, I
and
did.
Say, "Hey, Minister says." I mean, what was that like? Because you, before there, you'd worked within politics behind the scenes, because as a civil servant, you'd advised around the whole media space, including people like John Prescott, no end. I mean, what was it like being up close and personal with those kind of characters, these big beasts of our politics? Tell us about that.
Yeah, everybody says, "Oh, Derek used to work for John Prescott," and that's true. I did, but I actually worked for Michael Portillo as well. Before I went to work for Prescott, when Portillo was the employment secretary, before they closed down the Department of Employment. Maybe this is just a consequence of having been a journalist who comes from Northern Ireland, but I've always been involved in politics. It's a thing that makes the world go round, and so it was really easy for me to get sucked into that whole political thing. But obviously as a civil servant, and later as a military officer, you can't be political in yourself. You have to maintain a neutral stance. So you work for the government of the day, irrespective of whether you agree with their policies or not. But once you get your head around that as a concept, I found it really straightforward. You do your best for the government of the day because they've been elected on the basis of a manifesto, and you do your best to deliver with them to deliver the manifesto promises. But the whole political dimension has always really interested me, and it was particularly interesting to see it at play around someone like John Prescott, who was a massive big beast in the political jungle.
He was. What a character. And do we get those characters these days? Question mark. They're a little bit, let's say, out of the packet, pre-produced in some cases. But
I don't know if you could have. Well, what I was going to say is I don't know that you could have a John Prescott who comes from his background and gets to the position he got to as deputy prime minister. But actually, we've seen some recent examples of people who've come on a similar route. But whether it's easier or harder to do that now than it was in Prescott's day, I don't know. But he was a fascinating character, and I had huge regard for him. He took a lot of heat from the media for all sorts of reasons, but I always thought, I might not have agreed with all his politics, but I always thought his heart was in the right place, and at the top of his mind was doing the best he could for the people that he represented.
Yeah, I agree. And we miss those characters. I mean, I don't think I've ever asked you, I'm sure people have asked you, but were you there at that famous punching the mulleted farmer incident?
No, but I've heard the story many times from the horse's mouth. I started working for John Prescott not long after the 1997 general election.
Wow, what a time!
Yeah, it was a fascinating time. But before the election, I'd been part of a team charged with selling off the railways at the Department of Transport, and we worked really hard at getting them off the books. And so by the time the election came around, most of the railway had been privatised, and a few little bits and pieces. And I remember sitting around a table looking at some of the others who were on the same team, thinking we're all for the high jump when this new government comes in because we just sold off the family silver. So after May '97, I was sort of keeping my head down. I was the head of news at the Department of Transport at the time, and Prescott came in, and I'd had a few interactions with him, and I was sitting at my desk one day in Great Minster House, and the phone rang, and it was his private office, and he said, "Derek, could you come across? The Deputy Prime Minister wants a word." And I'm thinking, this is it then. This is where I get handed my cards. So I went across. They were at Eland House down in Victoria, so I walked across to Eland House and went up to his office, and was invited in, sat down in a chair opposite him, and he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about my representation in the press gallery." He said, "I think I need a voice who's going to speak for me among the political journalists." And I thought, yeah, that's probably about right. Thinking he was about to tell me that he was going to make a political appointment. And so I bought it, and I said, "Well, okay. So did you have anyone in mind?" He looked at me for a minute and said, "Yeah, you." So I sort of. Well, I was quite surprised, but when I got over the surprise, I thought, yeah, this could be really interesting. I'm definitely up for some of that. So I became John Prescott's press secretary, and I did that job for a few years until the turn of the millennium, when I decided to leave and go and work for the railway industry. People who talk about the revolving door. I was in the revolving door. I went from the civil service to the railway industry. And I did that for a while, and then 9/11 happened, and not long after 9/11, I remember phoning someone in the government communication service, and because they'd been promoted, and we were having this conversation. I was congratulating them on their promotion, etc. And he said, "Oh, Derek, your job you've always wanted has just become vacant." And I said, "What job's that?" He said, "It's the director of news at the MOD." I said, "Well, it's a pity it didn't come vacant a while ago. I might have applied for that." He said, "It's not too late." So I put my hat in the ring to be the director of news at the MOD, and got invited to see Geoff Hoon, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And I went along and had a chat with Geoff, and he said, I've been spying on you. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I've talked to John Prescott about you. And I was thinking, well, Prescott wasn't best pleased when I told him I was leaving. Um, and I was thinking, well, that probably didn't go all that well for me. So I said to Hunch, well, so I'll just get up and go now because clearly that's not going to have gone well. And he said, no, he told me he thought that you were the best possible person for the job. And so lo and behold, I was appointed as director of news at the MOD, just as we were going into Afghanistan for the first time in 2001. And what a time that was! That was just incredible.
Well, it seems absolutely remarkable that we are just about to hit in 2026 the 25-year anniversary of that time. And what a fascinating time to be involved in communications. But your background, so you were cap badge and infanteer, if I'm right in pointing out, and you found yourself on deployment too. You mobilised a few times in uniform as well as working as a civil servant for defence. What kind of roles did you find yourself on deployment? Were they media advisory type roles?
Yeah, so the first time I went to Afghanistan actually was as a civilian. So I flew into Kabul a few days after John Simpson and the BBC liberated the city from the Taliban, and it was so quickly after the liberation that when we landed in a Special Forces Hercules at Kabul International Airport, we actually bumped over the repairs where they filled in the holes that the Americans had made when they bombed the runway. But actually, I went back a few times with Hoon while I was working for him. But then in 2006, I found myself mobilised, and originally I was mobilised to go to Iraq, but they decided that in their infinite wisdom that they were going to send me to Afghanistan instead. So this was just as the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps has taken over command of all the NATO forces in the country based in Kabul. So I found myself sitting in the headquarters in Kabul. The post I'd been sent into was a media operations post, and that's pretty much what I did. But I spent a lot of time actually as a planner, so representing media ops within the planning cycle at the headquarters, and as a reservist, I found that was really fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So I was in Kabul just at the start of the British deployment to Helmand. And so I saw some of the early stuff that went on down in Helmand, including the time when a Sunday Times journalist who got blistered onto one of the three para companies, and they did a patrol into a place called Zumbulay, which is near Sangin, and they got bumped on the way out, and the journalist basically put this story over 5 pages of the Sunday Times. And that was the point where suddenly the people in the MOD began to wake up and think, actually, the operation that we're going to have to conduct here is a bit different from the one that we thought we were going to be doing when we actually decided on the size and scale of the deployment. And so it all sort of that was the start of the change, really. And it's one of the things that when I decided to think about writing a book about Afghanistan, is one of the things that I had in mind. That whole sort of media piece about the government saying we're going there as peace support operation, and that's what they geared up to do, but actually finding that when the rubber hit the road in Helmand, the situation was quite different and much more dangerous and much more bloody, and we found ourselves there with a force that was probably too small for the task that we had to do.
And we're certainly going to come onto your book in this podcast, and I think there's a nice segue there between yourself, the title of this podcast, Veterans in Politics, and some of those characters involved at the time, because the role of the media in bringing what was going on to the attention of the UK public was in no small part played by some of the politicians as well in uniform. So we had the likes of Mark Lancaster, who of course is now Major General Mark Lancaster, as they're serving the Lord Kimbolton, a member of the House of Lords, a former Minister for the Armed Forces, and at the time a relatively junior army officer who deployed to Afghanistan and started being noisy about what was going on there as well, including in the House of Commons. I think that was probably around about the time when all of that stuff was going on for you. I mean, what was the political situation versus the journalistic situation versus the military situation like at the time?
Yeah, it was a really interesting time, and there were lots of different pressures going on. So up in Kabul, I was sitting in the middle of a NATO headquarters, and so the commanding general didn't report first to who was a Brit, didn't report first to London. He reported first to Brussels, and that definitely created a few tensions because once things started to go wrong down in Helmand, which is UK territory, the UK Ministry of Defence wanted to try and manage the messaging, and so they were basically putting pressure on to tell a particular story, and that story was for quite a long time. The story was stick to the narrative. This is a peace support operation, but actually the reality on the ground was telling a different story because the situation in Helmand wasn't anywhere near as secure and stable as people had suggested and had led the British public to believe. And very quickly we found that the story that the politicians had been trying to tell in Parliament and elsewhere was cracking under the strain of what was actually happening on the ground, and that was quite an interesting time to be on the sort of sidelines and watching that play out.
And then all of a sudden you get a member of the opposition, a mobilised reservist, deployed to Afghanistan in Mark Lancaster, then I think writing to the Telegraph, I think at the time. So it just goes to show, I think some of the reasons that people care about the armed forces, or why Westminster sometimes care, is because we've got veterans in politics, be they working for a member of parliament, be they members of parliament themselves, and we've got now 14 veterans of Afghanistan in Westminster, would you believe it? Well, in the House of Commons. And I think, when you hear these voices coming back, their experiences, it's bound to influence some of the decision making as real life lived experiences. So I think I think the military and politics will always be intertwined for that very reason. And yeah, I think it's good.
And I think that's really important because, for a long time post the Second World War, there weren't that many people around in Parliament who had military experience. So bringing that military experience into the parliamentary debate, I think is a good thing. It probably puts a little bit of pressure on parliamentarians who are still serving reservists, because a serving reservist, you still got to toe the line. But having them there and having that experience there, I think is generally that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. So fast forward, you and I then meet at Defence Relationship Management, and we start to deliver an effect, as you say, based on what we saw around the reservist experience. And the ask was really clear to industry about how we need to better engage with our reservist population, but also how industry can benefit. Now, we saw that take off really quickly. From your media background, how did you see the positives and perhaps even the negatives around the narrative rapidly change during the early stages of the Covenant? Because it was came from out of nowhere, really, the whole Covenant thing. And it evolved from the corporate Covenant and the community Covenant into the Armed Forces Covenant. How did you see some of the narratives of your kind of journalistic hat on evolve during that time from where you were sat?
So I think prior to 2014, there wasn't really a narrative that set out to articulate the benefits that civilian employers could get from employing reservists, or indeed ex-regulars. And that's one of the big changes that came about as a result of that white paper. We developed a narrative that was designed to try to persuade civilian employers that this wasn't a zero-sum game for them, that it wasn't all take by the MOD, that they got something back from being forces friendly. One of the things they got back from being forces friendly was that they had access to a big pool of potential recruits. Who these are the people who are leaving the armed forces with all these skills and experiences that actually, in many cases, transfer very neatly into that civilian world of work. But because we hadn't been talking about it very much, civilian employers didn't really get that. So one of the things that DRM did and did really successfully was helping to get those key messages across to civilian employers about so when you're supporting your reservist, it's not just doing us a favor in the MOD, you're doing yourself a favor as well. And actually, I think DRM, Defence Relationship Management, was really quite successful at persuading civilian employers that there was something in this for them. And one of the tools that we used, one of the bridges that we used to do that was the employer recognition scheme, which the first year we ran it. So when we did FR20, we did a consultation with employers. One of the things they told us is that if you want us to be supportive and do all these things, then we would like some form of recognition. So the employer recognition scheme was the answer to that question, really. The other thing they wanted, by the way, was that they said, well, if you want us to employ lots more reservists, then maybe you could give us a national insurance holiday, so that eases the pain of employing a reservist. We were never able to deliver that because the Treasury just dug their heels in and said no. But I suspect that we may come knocking on that door again sometime in the future, because we've got a promise in the Strategic Defence Review to expand the reserves again, and we've got a promise in the Strategic Defence Review to grow the size of the cadet movement. And the cadet movement can't grow without cadet force out of volunteers. So if you're going to ask employers to take on more cadet force out of volunteers, I'm sure they're going to be asking, well, what's in it for us? And one of the things that's probably going to be back on the table again is, national insurance holiday. So we'll see. But I nothing to do with me, but I think the whole idea of setting up defence relationship management and creating this team of relationship managers, of which you were a member, actually was fantastically successful. And I think one of the measures of that success has been to watch how the employer recognition scheme has grown and grown and grown. I think we had about 9 gold winners that first year. And now it's got to the stage where we've had to break it down into regions because it's too big to run at a national level anymore. And I think that speaks volumes about the success.
And full credit to you and our colleagues and the MOD in the early days getting royal patronage, because we had Prince William, Prince Harry, whatever happens to that guy, come and attend and present those awards. I remember the magic of being in their company and seeing the engagement that they had with employers and what that meant to the employers. So I think the point you make about recognition through the employer recognition scheme is really important one to make, because we ask a lot from our employers, and some of the ideas around national insurance holiday, I think you're right, they're going to pop up again. Indeed, we've seen the Conservative Party offer something else in that the MOD shouldn't be taxing reservists. So other ideas that have come into the fray. So this whole debate around reservists is certainly not going to go away, and certainly as the notion of conflict becomes a more whole societal view as well. I think reservists, they had a lot of time in Afghan Iraq under the spotlight, but I think we're about to see even more of that in the political debate in the coming years. That's for sure.
I'm absolutely sure you're 100% right on that, and I look forward to watching that debate from the sidelines.
Well, you're slightly not on the sidelines, of course, because you're now, I said weapons free, but that's perhaps that's been a bit liberal with the phrase. But it's been really good to see you on LinkedIn. Very vocal, very active, but always adding value. And one of the things that you are adding value with is using your skills, your lifelong skill, and also your lifelong love of the armed forces, and particularly the contributions of Northern Ireland and the Irish to conflict and to the British Army in particular. And you've recently just launched a fantastic book, Shamrock Among the Poppies. Tell us a bit about the motivation behind that. Why did you embark on this endeavour, this passion project, and what's that taught you so far?
So I had, when I retired, my bachelor's degree is in history and my master's degree is in military history. And I've always wanted to write a military history book. And so when I retired, I wrote a military history of the 48th South Midland Division. It's a book called A Brilliant Little Victory, and it tells the story of that division and its experiences in the war. And I'd done it, and I had it published, and I was looking around thinking, well, what shall I do now? And I knew at the back of my head, I knew there was that the Musicala thing was a big thing in my regiment, the Royal Irish, and I'd read Adam Jowett's book, No Way Out, which tells his story of the siege of Musicala. And I'd read Stuart Tootle's book, in which he covers it as part of a wider piece.
And of course, you and I worked really closely with Stuart when he was at Barclays during the Defence Relationship Management days.
Indeed, we did. And just in case he's listening, it's a great book, Stuart. Well done. And Adam Jowett's book is a really good book as well. But there was a thing. The thing that struck me about those books were, first of all, they were officers' accounts, and they were written from the experiences of the authors themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. As I say, that they're both really good books, and people who are interested in what was going on in Afghanistan at that time should absolutely go out and buy them. But I wanted to do something different, and that was that I wanted to tell the story of the siege of Musicala through the eyes not of the officers who were in command, but of the Rangers and NCOs who were actually doing most of the fighting. So I conceived this idea of writing a book that told the story in through the eyes of the soldiers who fought there, and as far as possible in their words. I talked to regimental headquarters and the regimental colonel, and there was a lot of support for the idea of producing this, not least because there is no, up until this book was published, there had been no account from a Royal Irish Regiment perspective of the siege of Musicala. So I set about doing the research that forms the basis of the book, and clearly, if I was going to tell the story through the eyes of the soldiers who were there, I was going to need to talk to a lot of the soldiers, and that sort of threw up the first hurdle, really, because although the soldiers are quite happy to talk about their experiences among themselves, in many cases they're quite cagey about talking about it to people they don't know, and they didn't know me, although I wore the Royal Irish Cap badge and the tactical recognition flash. Most of my service had been at staff, so I'd spent very little time at regimental duty. So I was kind of an unknown quantity to a lot of those soldiers, and it was really interesting. One of the guys who served there was a guy called Danny Groves, and he was a corporal and he was a mortarman. And but before he switched to mortars, he was on the close observation platoon of the 1st Battalion down in South Armagh. And Danny, when I made contact with him, he came and conducted a close target recce on me, using his platoon skills,
transferable skills.
Yeah, so he turned up at my house one day and he said, "Right, we need to have a chat about this." Brought my diary, so he'd kept a journal of his time in Musicala, and things like that are gold dust to historians. So I definitely wanted to get my hands on this diary. So we came in, and we sat around my kitchen table, and we had a few cups of tea. And as I say, he asked me he asked me more questions than I asked him. But the upside of that was that he then went back and talked to his band of brothers, and persuaded them that I was going to be okay, and that they should think about engaging. and a lot of them did, and that made the book really. Because once I got talking to them, these guys really opened up, and talked about not only about their experiences, but how those experiences affected them, physically and just as importantly, mentally.
Well,
So
I think it's a fantastic name for a book as well. And for any of our listeners, we'll make sure that we put the link to Derek's book in the show notes. And on storytelling, I mean, some 2 decades later since that time, how important is the role of storytelling in the soldier's tale?
I think it's vital. If you want people to remember, um, the bravery and the courage and the resilience and the sheer bloody mindedness of those soldiers in Helmand province at that time, um, the way to do that is through telling their stories, and that's what the book set out to do. Um, and as I said, right at the start, telling those stories as far as possible in their own words. So it's not me as a retired lieutenant colonel telling the story in my words. I sat down and interviewed these guys, and some cases the interviews were 2 and 3 hours long. And I have transcribed those interviews and then used them to weave together a sort of a verbal picture of what was actually going on in that compound at the time. And the book couldn't really have worked in the way that I wanted it if those guys hadn't been prepared to open up and tell their stories. And some of the stories are really quite harrowing, particularly some of the stories of young soldiers who served there, and then found themselves struggling with mental health issues when they got back, and in some cases the lack of support that was available to them, when they returned, and as a particular issue for soldiers who left the army and went back to settle in Northern Ireland where they came from, where the quality of care and the availability of care is much less perhaps than in other parts of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I think it's really important to tell these stories, and particularly the story within the story. And you will know that my work as one of the co-founders of the UK Afghanistan Veterans Community, which is pretty much the Normandy Veterans Association for our generation, in some of our research that we did with M&C Saatchi World Services, having interviewed 1,600 people via survey, 92% of those told us that they fear their stories and sacrifice will be forgotten. So with that, Derek, I just want to thank you for being the storyteller, because that flies in the face of that fear. And we need to take responsibility as our community, as storytellers, and those of us with skills, be it through podcasting or journalism or writing, to tell the stories, because it's really important that we tell them.
Well, thanks for your kind words, but you make a really important point about these stories, because you know the book is based in 2006, just as we went back to Afghanistan again, having been there in 2001, and there's an awful lot of years that rolled by where brigade after brigade after brigade were cycled through Helmand province, and the danger is that the efforts and the actions of the soldiers who were there right at the start have kind of got buried under 8 more years of fighting and dying, and so that's, for me, that's one of the reasons why it was so important to produce this book. So there's an ongoing public record of what actually happened right at the start of that Helmand deployment, and that'll be around now for posterity. Musa Kala has almost mythical status within the Royal Irish Regiment. They've even written a march entitled Musa Kala for the pipes and drums. But I think, talking to other people out and about, the public at large have largely forgotten about what happened at the early part of the deployment, because so much happened afterwards. So I think it was really important to be able to put that down in black and white as a record for the future, and not just so that in the future people can look back and say, oh well, that's what the Royal Irish got up to at that particular time. It's also important I think to just have that record that's not going to go away. The books might get tossed on a fire, but somewhere in a library, that book will always exist, and probably it'll exist online now as well, because we need to have a conversation with the publisher about turning it into a digital version. So that's not going to go away, and that's
Well, I
really
look
cool.
forward to that. I look forward to that. And yeah, that's part of the reason I do the podcast, I guess. Being a dad, having one, I'm sure one day my little girl will watch or listen to some of this and cringe. But it's really important that we lay down on record the history and
Yeah,
our stories. It's really important. Indeed, today we're actually seeing the current generation of those serving continuously storytelling, because the Instagram soldiers now a thing. We're starting to see people doing vlogs in uniform, behind the scenes, a day of life of me, cutting about at work. And this is the next post-Afghan generation. And I think it's fantastic, because all of a sudden you're getting empathy from a new generation and going, actually, that person looks a little bit like me, talks a bit like me. What they're describing sounds really cool. But there's a slight however. I think that the armed forces influencer, particularly those still serving, is something the MOD hasn't got a clue about how to manage. And actually, I mean, I'll be interested to get your views on this as a journalist. I almost think there needs to be a talent arm of the Directorate of Defence Comms, DDC, to start managing some of these social media influencers, because they're popping up as fitness influencers or vloggers. And as far as I can see, some of them need a little bit of mentorship and guidance, because it has a huge potential in recruitment in a positive way, but it doesn't come without risk.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And social media is powerful, and it can do so much good and so much bad depending on how you choose to use it. I think that part of the problem in defence, if I might say so, is that it's not so much that DDC are not aware of how to manage these things, um, and how to get the most out of the social media in that way. Uh, in my experience, the real issue is the nervousness of politicians to allow people to have weapons free. And I've found this all through my time in media ops in Iraq and Afghanistan. You could have a perfectly reasonable grown up conversation with the press office and the Minister of Defence about how you were planning to deal with a particular issue. Um, but but that wasn't the final arbiter. The final arbiter was the politicians, and the politicians often, um, because they were nervous about trusting soldiers to engage, would prefer to close it down. So I'm talking about it's quite a long time ago now. I'm talking about 2006, 2007, 2008. But I still detect that there's a bit of that going on, where the civilian bit of DDC, I think, would be prepared to be a bit more flexible and more open, but the real restriction is usually placed by the politicians.
I think you're right. My dealings with DDC have been really positive. Be that from working around the covenant within industry, or some of the stuff that I've done as an individual. I found them really quite agile and creative as the civilian arm. But I do suspect that you might be right. And it is funny though when you come across. I remember when I was in Afghanistan, we had Deborah Haynes come over to go on patrol with us. Obviously, world famous Sky News journalist, and there was a real nervousness detected around our little remote outpost in Afghanistan. But the commander on the ground did something really good, and he responded to a request from her, which was, "Can I speak to the troops?" And given, I'm not interviewing them. I just want to tell them about the role of an embedded journalist, what it is I do, take any questions from them, off the record. No such thing as off the record, but off the record, and just create a space, and it was really well received actually. And you're talking, to infanteers it's a whole new world to some of these lads and lasses, and I just found that a really refreshing approach, both from the MOD side of it and the army side of it, and also Deb Haynes as well, wanting to really engage rather than tipping up, jumping in the back of a wagon and being someone we've got to look after as an embedded journalist, to actually saying, well, I'm here, I want to give you my time and tell you about my role and what it is to help alleviate some of those concerns. So I think you were right in the centre of all that role between the military and the media. It must have been fascinating.
Yeah, so if Deborah's approach was pretty. That would be a pretty refreshing approach from the media generally. But I was just thinking while you were talking that you're talking about the birth of social media and how that's affected defence communications. Back in 2006, after that 5-page spread that had appeared in the Sunday Times, the MOD's initial approach was to say, right, that's it. We're going to close this all down. It's clearly getting dangerous down in Helmand, and the story there is not the one that we've been telling the public. So we're going to close it down. We're not going to have embeds with troops down in Helmand. That really hacked off the soldiers in Helmand, who then found that their story wasn't being told. And so soldiers can be very inventive, and this was before we had smartphones, but we had video cameras and we had internet access. So the boys started videoing the attacks on them and stuff, and then they were uploading that onto YouTube as a way of circumventing the ban on the media and making sure that the public at large got to see what was actually going on. And I thought that was really interesting, and it was a bit of a forerunner, if you like, to the way in which some people are using social media now.
Yeah, as you say, a bit of it can work for and against individuals and organisations, but it's there. We have to kind of embrace it, and
it's not going away. You can't.
It's not going away.
You have to. And I've always been of the view that whatever you do in communications is never risk-free. There's always a risk attached to an engagement with the media, and you can take measures to reduce that risk, but it never really goes away. So what you've got to do is be brave and lean into the risk, because the rewards can be huge if you get it right.
Well, wise words. And before we close out on similar wise words, if there are any of our listeners who might be from the media or someone serving who might want to transition into media roles, what would be some of the kind of both sides of that, some of the key areas you might want to look at, some of the skills where there is that crossover, that are things that they could really help further them looking at going one way or the other, but with that media interest at the core?
So I would say that first of all, that the skills that you learn and develop as a media person can potentially transfer across to the other side of the line quite easily, and some of those skills, particularly things like how you get information from people who don't really want to tell you. Or how do you interview someone who's never been interviewed before and make them feel at ease and get the information that you're looking for? Those are skills that the best journalists have in spades, and those same skills can be really useful when you're on that other side of the fence, if you like, looking out. So my advice to anyone in the media thinking about taking that leap is do it, because there's a lot to be gained from it in terms of wider experience. And even if you do it for a limited amount of time and then jump back, it will be of benefit to you as a journalist as well.
Perfect. And even occasionally you might have a bit of a busman's holiday like you, Derek. And
yeah.
and end up in an office with John Prescott and Geoff Hoon.
If you're really unlucky, yeah.
If you're really unlucky. Derek, this has been a fantastic canter through a long career in public service. You have done so much. Very unique roles as well. Thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for your book. We will share that. And if anyone does want to find out about that, we'll put that in the show notes. But Derek Plews, thank you. It's great to catch up, great to share your story. And we look forward for what's next for Derek.
Yeah, well, Jonny, thanks very much indeed for having me. It's been great, and it's great touching base with you again after such a long time. But what we really need to do, I think, is probably have a few chats over a beer at some point.
Sounds good to me.